lot of guys, some guys went back. A number of guys at the squadron were still, their families still in Butterworth. So they went back to Butterworth and then packed up and went home. One guy went back there and got married. We came back we repatriated. We went by Caribou, I think Caribou, I can't remember which aircraft now, down to Saigon. And we jumped on a Pan American 707 flying to Singapore. And the first flight, I got a picture of it taxiing out and taking off at Saigon. Taking off, there's a C-123 smashed on the side of the 105 had landed through him last night, and both of them exploded and tore this aircraft open like a can, and all killed. We thought, Christ, that's what we're leaving. That was the last sight of Saigon that we saw in Vietnam. And we went back to Singapore, stayed overnight in Singapore, and then picked up I think it was an Air India flight from there via Perth back to Brisbane. And then back home. So we got back home, and I went for a holiday with my wife up to the Whitsundays, and that was it. We just got back into squadron life, but we were all still pretty annoyed. We didn't have any big hang-ups. Some people did, but the biggest hang-up we had was the treatment that a lot of us got from the RSL and from the activists, and I think that really annoyed us. That's all we ever did see. That was pretty galling to see all that, no support, and especially from the World War II veterans in the RSL who ostracised us basically on the fact that we didn't go to a real war like they had. Well, the big thing is that we said, and none of us, we didn't fight them or anything like that, we just ignored them. But we're in a combat zone all the time in Vietnam. We had rocket attacks and various things all the time on the base. During World War II, most of the guys were there, and my father was in World War II, so I know firsthand what it was like. He was a siege of Tobruk and a rat of Tobruk. He was in the army for 7 years in the militia before the war. And he said World War II, he said, the only time he ever saw combat was when he was in the siege of Tobruk, and they weren't exercising the combat, or he wasn't, but they were dive-bombing Stukas and all the rest of it. And he said a lot of the other army guys in World War II, other than people on the Kokoda track and Crete and other areas, they weren't in combat zones all the time. They thought they were, but they weren't. Some were. Obviously, lots were. But all these guys are saying they were in the real war, but half of them weren't in a combat zone for the whole period. Might have been in combat zone for 2 or 3 months and then repatriated. We in Vietnam in the combat zone all the time. And the army guys, particularly, they were there for a year. I was there for 6 months. When we got home, the squadron guys, then 2 squadrons stayed for a year. So, it wasn't beer and skittles, and it wasn't real hardship, but the army guys had it hard. So we were pretty annoyed about all that. And the thing that we really were most annoyed about was the Jane Fondas of the world who went over there during the war. And, that's another story. But when I went to USA, we all went to USA 2 months later, training on the F-111. So we knew all the American stories, US Air Force stories, Jane Fonda's, the whole lot. So that really turned us off a bit. We had the return from Vietnam service march in 1987 in Sydney, which I went to, and that was the first welcome home for Australians in Vietnam since the Vietnam War finished 13 years before. And there was a lot of aggro out there, more from the army guys, and only for those who want to go to the RSL. I chose not to, and a lot of us chose not to because of those reasons. But we were still all in the Air Force anyway, flying. So it didn't affect the Air Force as much. Life in the Air Force flying in Vietnam was quite different to the Army. We had a silver fuselage and a couple of great engines, and you're in your own office, air-conditioned, warm. But life could change very quickly when hit by a missile, as it did with a couple of our guys, or the other ones who lost, crashed, killed. Life could change just like that. With the Army guys, life was much the same all the time. But ours went from great to bloody dreadful, all in one go, if you're knocked out. and lost. And that happened to the US Air Force guys a hell of a lot. But everything was really fine and crazy while everything was good. But your whole day could change just like that. We did our training course. We did a radar training out at Sacramento in California, and then we went off to New Mexico to train on the radar, what was called the weapons systems training course on the 111, because the 111 was quite a leap in technology to what we had in the Canberra. Canberra was a bloody nightmare. The 111 was a Cadillac. So we had to go through, we did 16 simulator missions training on the F-111. And the pilots were flying the aircraft before they even saw the aircraft. So then you had to fly it on the simulator before they even got in the cockpit. The simulator was a 111 cockpit. But it was all radar weapon systems training in the 111. And it was combined. It was what was called a navigation bombing system, quite different from the Canberra, where everything was run by an inertial navigation system was called a navigation bombing system. And that was the whole thing, based on an American strategic bombing command. We did training on our training systems that we trained on were initially at Mesa in Sacramento in California were B-47 and B-52 radar bombing systems that the Strategic Air Command flew. And that was all radar bombing system. We trained on all that. And that's what the 111 was. Two-place, pilot, navigator, and everything was integrated. And the whole weapon system was done on radar system, weapons control, the navigator controlled all the weapon systems. All the pilot did was fly the bloody aeroplane and have release consent. Push button on his side. We did all the rest. Set up the bombs and the whole lot. So it was a crew coordination thing. The aircraft had an escape module. We're sitting side by side. Pilot could see what I was doing. Navigator could see what the pilot was doing. The whole system was based on what was called a navigation bombing system. The electric system, the Canberra had a bizarre electrical system as older aircraft did. This new system had two AC alternators, 115 volts, 400 hertz systems. You had two, it was called one on each engine. Two transformer rectifier systems, which obviously transformed, reduced the voltage down, and transformed it to DC. So you had what was called AC buses, one on either side, DC buses to run all the different equipment. Totally different from the Canberra. Every time we put something in the Canberra, you put another inverter in or an inverter here, or something there. They had two DC generators, that was it. The whole 111 was a total different concept. And it was a totally crew coordination aircraft. You couldn't fly the aircraft one person. It needed two people. The weapons control system, this and the generators, and the terrain following radar right in front of the pilot had these 5 different terrain following radar for both of us, and the attack radar and the ECM and the electronic countermeasures all on the right-hand side, weapons control plan on the side. So it was a total new concept. Electric seat adjustment, air-conditioned, pressurised, shirt-sleeve environment. We were at Cannon Air Force Base. We did the weapons systems training, 16 flight simulators. We did it on what was called a landmass simulator. We then went to Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas to do our flight training. So we did flying training there. Pilots obviously did more flying than we did. We did 26 hours. I think the pilots did 32 to 35. They checked out in the aircraft, did their solo. And then we got in and did crew rides. And different instructors along the way. I had a US Navy instructor, a Royal Air Force instructor, an Australian Air Force instructor, and a USAF. So they had all different types there. That was quite easy to get used to. Run through checklist. Everything is checklist based. Crank up the inertial navigation platform. The inertial navigation system is the basis of all modern aircraft now. Civil aircraft, every aircraft in the world now flies on an inertial navigation system. We're the first generation one, which were basically electromechanical gyros to keep a stable platform. And the basis of all that was keep the platform stable with respect to the Earth. And you measure vehicle acceleration. As you accelerate, the accelerometers measure this to pick off coils that take a voltage, and that would be, and then using calculus, the first integral of acceleration is velocity. The second integral of velocity is distance gone. This is to be fed into the navigation computer after you set up your position where you are, what was called the present position. You then gyro compass the system and do what's called gyro compassing, set up where you were, level the platform. So okay, we've got a level platform now, you can start going. That provided the primary attitude reference to the aircraft, heading and attitude. We had auxiliary flight systems for different reference and an emergency. But that was the basic of the system. Current aircraft systems are exactly the same concept. Technology is different, of course. They're all laser ring gyros now and all the rest. But all the aircraft had that, and that's what the 111 had, the first one we had, and then the Phantoms that had it earlier than that. And then the P3s had it as well. So that was the basis of our navigation system. And really it was all radar navigation. We had TACAN, radar navigation, and that was it. It was far better than any of the Navy aircraft. The Phantom, I got on the Phantoms again after that. This one was far better in that regard. It was called the Cadillac of the skies. It really was. And all different aircraft systems, different systems and wing sweep. It had just about everything you can think of. To me, we get fairly blasé about it. We used to TFR down around the Grand Canyon, not in the Grand Canyon, but over the top of it. Went on a weapons range out there this particular night. We went, first crew ride it was. In other words, with our own Aussie crew. Went to a weapons range off Tonopah out from Vegas and doing a low-level bombing. The target was about 500 feet. We're bombing at 500 feet. The target was about 1,100 feet, but the mountains around it were 13,000, 14,000 feet. So we come in, have to roll in downwind at about 14 to 15,000, turning right, dropping all this, losing all this altitude. Then it was dusk, and then it turned to night because at night time there were 4 of us in the pattern. So it was all pretty frightening and new to all of us, and we only kept our spacing by collision light, anti-collision light, or air-to-air TACAN. 4 Aussies in the platform. We got back to the debrief, and all the US flight commanders came in to see how we all went. And our commander, then Wing Commander Bill Hughes, said, "Geez, you put us into the bloody shit there, didn't you?" And they said, "Yeah." And he asked them, "How did the USAF crews go on those sorties?" And he said, "We didn't put them in there. What you guys have said, we ain't going to either." So we were not the sacrificial lamb, but almost, to see how it all went. It was a fair bit of adrenaline in the pattern at night with 4 of us there at night, dropping 15,000, 12,000 feet to get onto the bloody ground to hit the target. And then there's a big mountain in front of us, 7 miles past the target, afterburn to get back in the circuit. And there are 4 of us. So we deployed from there. We went and picked the first aircraft up at Fort Worth in Texas in September 1968. And then they said, "Oh, by the way, we've grounded the aircraft because one had wing fell off one day before, and they'd lost a couple." And then a big, long story about it. I won't go into details of all that, but our engineering staff and all the rest, the aircraft, we had one of ours at Sacramento in California that flew back to Fort Worth. Our government wouldn't accept them until they had a redesigned wing carry-through box, which had been redesigned by Boeing and been fitted into the F model 111. We had a C model. We trained on the A model. The Navy version was the B model, which they cancelled. Ours were C models. We had the same wing carry-through box as the A. Our government said, "We're not going to accept them until you redesign and put in a new wing carry-through box," which they did, and that was fitted to the F model, which we didn't get, of course, but we got the wing carry-through box on that model, and that took 5 years. Government said, "Okay, on that basis, we need to get an interim aircraft." So it was negotiated. Malcolm Fraser was the Defence Minister. Went back to Melvin Laird, who was the Defence Secretary in US Air Force. And negotiated lease of the Phantom. So we went back again in July 1970. After doing the 111 course, we used to send guys to England to do weapons. 2 courses at the Royal Air Force College of Air Warfare. One was called the Aero Systems course, which was 12 months. I did the Weapons Employment course, which was 3 months. So that was mainly about weapons. It was a generic course, Weapons Employment. We had blokes on, well, I was the only Aussie on board. There was a German, I think. And most of them were Brits, Vulcans and Harriers and Jaguars and those sorts of aircraft. It was the generic course. Basically, it was about over-target requirements, how to plan big sorties. A lot of it came out of World War II, in fact. Just don't go and drop bombs like we did in Vietnam. You go back and you employ weapons against a particular target. You've got to design, hey, what is the target? What do you want to hit? What's the damage? What are the defences? What have you got? What weapons can you use against it for the target effects, weapons effects on the target? What do you want to do? Demolish it, blow it to bits, whatever. So you've got to match what the weapons to target matching. How many aircraft do you need? How many hits do you need to get the required damage to put it out of action or demolish it? All these sorts of calculations to work out. You just don't go and throw bombs at things. And the employment manual was an RAF publication called the 642G. The Americans had a publication called JMEMS, JMEMS, Joint Munitions Effects Manual. So these were the 2 things that we trained on the RAF. Then later on we changed with the American ones. But basically it was about what bombs you use for this target, single shot probabilities, probability of hitting the target, probability of damage, how many sorties do you need, what attack direction should you have, what you should employ, depending on what the type of target was. What did you want to do? This is before precision guided munitions came in. The 111 was equipped for these, but we didn't get it. It had the functionality for it, but we didn't have them equipped. And they were first generation PGMs anyway in Vietnam, and the Americans used them to a limited effect, but they were a weapons proving ground for what they have for the PGMs later on. And that came later. And so it was all to do with all that. And even with precision guided munitions, you still need to look at what's the target you're going to hit, what weapon have you got, what damage do you want, what the chances of it, what's the single shot probability, how many do you need to knock it down, and so on. And the Yanks went through all this with knocking bridges down in Vietnam, but that's another issue, the whole thing. But they mounted so many sorties trying to knock a bridge down, they lost 20 aircraft in one of them. There's a number of bridges. I won't get into all the details there about all that because that's fairly complex. But there's a lot of bridges up there, and they put in an aircraft with PGMs and knocked the bridge out. But then the coup de grace on one of the bridges was taken over with a direct hit by a Mark 82 unguided bomb. So PGMs aren't the panacea because they were first generation stuff then anyway. We eventually got them on 111s later on when I was up in the weapons side of defence. I was a project officer on a lot of that for the upgrades of the 111s. But so that was what it was about, generic stuff. And we did nuclear weapons training as well. On the 111, we did nuclear weapons usage on the 111, but that's when it stopped. We didn't get any further than that. In fact, I went off to a weapons planning conference later on and replaced the nuclear weapons panel with I'll show you what I replaced it with. That's Harpoon delivery platform, which went into the right-hand corner of the 111 where the nuclear weapons control panel was, and that was designed, which I designed with the human factors engineering in Fort Worth in Texas to deliver the Harpoon anti-ship missile. And that's now a bookend. Phantom was a great aeroplane, brutish and uncouth. People couldn't understand why it flew. It did. Great engines, accelerate with no problems. You couldn't run both engines up with the brakes because the tyres would rotate around the rims. The brakes couldn't hold it, in other words. If you had low fuel, you'd be doing 600 knots before the end of the runway, pull it back and climb at 85 degrees. and it'd roll over the top at about 80 knots, 35,000. It was an air interceptor, designed as an air interceptor, had a gun on it, 20mm gun, 6,000 rounds a minute. We backed it off to 4,200. Only carried 630 rounds anyway. The 111 had a gun. It carried 2,000 rounds, same gun. We took it out though for later on. That's another thing. Phantom was great. Didn't have the range. It was not a radar bomber. It had a dive bomb. You get range, ground and air to ground ranging from the radar to feed into the weapons computer to release into the weapons release computer, and the pilot would pull 4G and the bomb would come off automatically in a mode called dive toss. But the aircraft was not, I couldn't bomb at night in all weather because you couldn't see the target. The radar was no good for that. The 111 was a ground mapping attack radar. The F4 was an air intercept radar. Great for picking up targets, but that's what it was designed for. But it was not a ground all-weather capability that we wanted. But it was great day attack aircraft. We flew everywhere in that 4 ships formation. 111s, we only flew 1, sometimes 2. At night, solo. F4s everywhere day, 4 ship. Great gutsy ground attack aircraft. That's all it was. As in great air interceptor, we didn't buy it for that. But it was a good technology introduction to us from the Canberra 111. Then we had to come back to the Canberra before we got the 111. It was a great introduction to the Air Force to manage a new technology, high technology aircraft with all its limitations. People wanted to keep it, but it didn't do what we wanted. We wanted an all-weather strike capability, which the 111 had and the Phantom didn't. Could fly to Perth via Alice Springs to get out of the headwinds across the Bight with a big 600-gallon tank. That was about it. When we travelled with it, long ferry, we always carried 2 370-gallon tanks on the wingtips, travel anywhere, a big 600-gallon tank as well. And that's how we ferried the aircraft back from the States. Every sortie in the 111s, we had at least 2 practice radar targets, made a point of that, and radar targets, and we used to monitor all that, what the efficiency of guys flying it. We used to drop a lot of high explosive bombs around the place. Mostly the ranges had closed a lot by then. We used to go to Dutson down at South East Sale. We only dropped high explosive bombs. That was the only one left. Later on, we got on board with Townsend Island. We used to drop a lot of practice bombs, but every sortie was a bombing sortie and a practice radar target, at least 1, certainly 1, but maybe 2, and then a sortie through the bombing range at Evans Head. And that's what we did all the time. I went from there, 6 months on there, went to Air Staff at Amberley, where I was there for 3 years. That's as a weapons specialist at Air Staff. We did all the arrangements in weapons camps and weapons trials. The other guys in the squadrons just flew. I went to Air Force office where I was in 3 years in the operational requirements branch, where I was looking after the 111 projects. So it was called the operational requirements strike reconnaissance. So my first project was the PAVTAC infrared target acquisition tracking system, infrared, laser, and the Harpoon missile, anti-ship missile. So I was on that for 3 years. I was the project lead for that. So I visited the States a lot and UK. In fact, the last 111 flight was with a USAF aircraft out of Lakenheath near Cambridge in an F model 111, the 428th fighter wing that attacked Gaddafi. I went from Amberley to Air Force office in the operational requirements side of Defence Department, DEF-AIR we called it then, Defence Air Force Office, which is operational requirements. And it was specifically strike reconnaissance on the F-111 projects, weapons implementation and the PAVTAC weapon system and this Harpoon panel. I designed that with the the guys in Fort Worth who designed the aircraft. I did the concept planning. They designed the human factors engineering people, did all that. I just told them what I wanted, what the concepts were, what we wanted, what order, what priority, what modes of launch we wanted, skim, patterns, those sorts of things with the Harpoon anti-ship missile, which had an active radar head. And I've even got a Harpoon up there. You want to look at the Harpoon? There's the model of the Harpoon. P3s used to employ them. You've got a new, different type missile now for the F-35s and Super Hornets. So I had a bit of weapons work all the way through with all that stuff. All the way through with the 111, we're looking at the structural integrity, life of type of the airframe. The fatigue monitoring was being done all the way along by the engineers. The Materials Research Laboratory, commonly called MRL in Melbourne, Maribyrnong in Melbourne, they were monitoring things. I don't know the full details of what they had, but they had one of the aircraft, an old unbuttoned A model, and I think they did structural tests on the wing carry-through box and pivot pitting and all the rest of it in the late 2000s, early 2010s. The aircraft retired, as you know, in December 2010. The concept of operations changed a bit to network-centric warfare. That was with the incoming F-35s. The 111 didn't have that concept. It could be modified to what's called, I think the system was a link system, but basically a data link from satellite data and other aircraft, buddy data, wherever the data was coming from, targeting data basically to the aircraft or being transmitted as well. It could be modified by that, but would have been on an airframe that was, by this time, 50 years old, 45 anyway. Concept design was 50 years old. We had re-engined the aircraft, had new wingtips on the aircraft, re-engined, re-avionics, they'd gone through avionics update program, new engines, new TFR, new, just everything new except the airframe. New wings, but not new wing carry-through box. I believe the MRL couldn't ensure the structural integrity beyond 2010 or 2015, I think was the figure that they quoted, the year they quoted. But because of other costs and things, and Angus Houston was the Chief of Air Force at the time, because of other imperatives, I guess, and other priorities and costs of maintaining the aircraft and or modifying them, and with this structural integrity hanging over its head, decided to retire it. There's no question it was a great platform at the time. A lot of people maintain we shouldn't have got rid of them. I don't know enough about the structural integrity to counter that view. It certainly had the capability, and we've never had any capability like it since, and never will. Never will is not quite true. We might have for the B-21. The aircraft was performing beautifully because it had the avionics update program. Everything was superb, avionics-wise and system-wise, laser ring gyros, everything on it was superb. Guided weapons provisions, the whole lot. It was going great. I don't know enough about the details though, because I wasn't there